I'm going to give a historical perspective, but interestingly, it's very complementary to a number of the things that we've already heard. My research is focused on how to research noise historically. And my book, you can see on the screen here, it's called The Age of Noise in Britain, argues that over the course of the first half of the 20th century, different ways of hearing noise informed and reflected different kinds of ambitions for what the modern should be. Negotiating noise in that context became a way of negotiating modernity. That's a very short version of the book. I have to leave you to read it if you want to know more about that. We've already seen this image, actually. It cropped up in a talk earlier. This is the logo of the Anti-Noise League, formed in Britain in 1934. This logo was actually designed in 1935. And it was in this period, 1920s and 1930s, that the first noise abatement organisations were formed in Europe and North America. You can see in this image some of the familiar culprits that cause noise. And that's why I've blown it up nice and big so you can study the details of this. We've heard about traffic noise. Motor traffic is very prevalent in this image, 1935. Also some less familiar. So on the left here you can just see, perhaps I'll just point it out here, glass milk bottle delivery. Because when milk was delivered to your house, it would come very early in the morning in a metal crate with glass bottles. You can imagine the kind of acoustic effect that produces. So that was actually one of the big concerns about noise in the mid-1930s, was early morning milk delivery. So my first reflection on the question of what noise is, move the slide on, is based on the historical research I've done, is that the category of noise, in other words, what kinds of sounds count as noisy, is less self-evident than it might appear. In common usage, as we've heard a number of times today, we've got a shared understanding of what we mean by the word noise. Perhaps it means unwanted sound, although not if you're Marie Thompson. Perhaps it means meaningless or out-of-context sound. Personally, I've not found those definitions particularly helpful to taking an historical approach, because the historical archive shows that rather than being a stable sonic category, noise is produced as a meaningful category of sound in different ways at different times. And the point I want to make is that a considerable amount of cultural work goes on and goes into creating the category of noise, of transforming sounds into noises. It's not just noise abatement campaigns that do this work, but also commercial and public organisations. All of these kinds of groups have a stake in shaping noise and negotiating noise. And so I have a series of images and texts that I want to show you that illustrate the kind of cultural work that I mean that goes on around noise to create a sound as a noise. So this image, for example, it accompanied a 1930s advert for noiseless typewriters. This was quite a big thing in the mid-1930s. So here, the sound made by predominantly female typists in office environments was promoted as noise by manufacturers of noiseless typewriters, such as this one. This is Underwood Noiseless, came out in 1933, and this is something you could purchase for your office if certain kinds of office workers were complaining about the noise being made by typists. This reflected a dominant trend in interwar noise abatement to identify mechanical noise as a social problem, primarily affecting what were described as brain workers, so those involved in intellectual work, rather than those involved in manual and clerical labour, such as typists. So noise was defined by Britain's Anti-Noise League, active at this time, and others, as something that destroyed thought or the ability to think clearly. But for now, I just want to give some context to these kind of images. I just simply want to draw your attention to the way in which the silent typewriter and its accompanying advertising classifies the sound of a typist typing as noise. The existence of this object creates the category of typing noise as noise. And I think this makes an interesting contrast to an almost contemporaneous attempt to classify cinema as noise. So almost at exactly the same time, you have a number of people staking a claim that cinema is noise in the same way that the sound created by a typewriter is noise. And there's two quotes here from two really well-known writers, both of whom were involved in anti-noise campaigning of one kind or another. The novelist Georges Duhamel was involved in the French noise abatement campaign, and his travel book, America the Menace, was a warning about what would happen if France were to follow the United States in its adoption of new technologies in cultural terms. And through the book, Duhamel draws sharp distinctions between the quiet cultures of civilized Europe and the noisy cultures of America. And here he describes the sound of a cinema. He particularly dislikes the music. He describes it as music canned from the slaughterhouse of music, as the breakfast sausage comes from the slaughterhouse of swine, a sort of soft dough of music, nameless and tasteless. It's a terrible machine, he means the cinema, so elaborately dazzling with its luxury, its music, its human voice, a machine for stupefying and destroying the mind. The cinema being described in very similar ways to motor cars, typewriters. So, like Huxley below, Duhamel thought that the effect of sound film was to deaden thought and to produce uncritical hearing rather than attentive, critical, intellectual listening. And here's Huxley saying a very similar thing. He's going to the cinema. He said, "The flesh crept as the loudspeaker poured out the sodden words, the greasy, sagging melody. I felt ashamed of myself for listening to such things, for even being a member of the species to which such things were addressed. I comforted myself a little with the reflection that a species which has allowed all its instincts and emotions to degenerate and putrefy in such a way must be near either its violent conclusion or its no less violent transformation." Noise abatement campaigns at this time often sought out the collaboration of writers like these, precisely because they had the power to imaginatively produce noise in their works. And cinema, I think, is an interesting example of precisely because it didn't succeed. In the 1960s, after the passing of the first Noise Abatement Act in Britain, local councils for the first time had significant legal powers to intervene in everyday sounds. But still, work went into creating noise as a meaningful category. Here you can see a local authority post on the street in London. I think it's in Hackney. We see a group of children playing in the street, identified as a possible source of noise. Interesting that you get this kind of double articulation of the creation of noise, both the poster and the implied potential source of noise. Similar period, reflecting a trend away from identifying machines as sources of noise and towards certain kinds of people as creators of noise. The post-war Noise Abatement Society ran a public campaign encouraging people to send in drawings of ISUs, which you can see on his hat there. ISU stands for the Intelligence and Sensitivity Underprivileged. The drawings I've seen, such as this one, tie noise quite closely to what are evidently supposed to be people of low-class status, put it that way. There's a lot more to say about that. By the 1970s, when an intriguing experiment called the Darlington Quiet Town experiment was launched to quiet an entire town in the north of England, the aim was clear. This government campaign and experiment was not just to create quiet, but to activate noise as a meaningful category of sound. Children in particular were asked to write poems and short stories about noise in schools. Adults were asked to design posters. Here you see a photograph of a shouting contest. The children were shouting into a microphone there to educate people about decibels. Particularly like the T-shirt there, no to noise. Public information campaign. The experiment was notable primarily for its public campaign to raise awareness about noise. It transformed the people of the town into certain kinds of listeners, listening out for certain kinds of sounds as noise. But interestingly, in contrast to the 1930s noise culture, which had emphasized the quiet needs of usually male brain workers, and identified women more typically as creators of noise through activities such as typing or housework, in the Darlington Quiet Town experiment, the implied listener is usually female, as in this image. She's made responsible for listening out for noise, in this case, primarily noise as a threat to domestic life and to the education of children. Here's an example of the kind of listening that I mean here. The Darlington campaign is typical of this kind of work. It asks its viewer whether they have a noisy gnome in their home. And the noisy gnome here, if you just look a little bit more carefully at it, is clearly the husband. It's not a noisy neighbour. It's the husband of the house. The noisy gnome is banging on walls, doing DIY, listening to his music. The character down the bottom right is just sitting on a stool, perturbed by the music. But this second version really shows you more clearly that what the noisy gnome is. Never closes doors quietly, leaves his dog uncontrolled. in the back garden and banished from the house by the keeper of quiet. So my point in showing you all of these examples is that noise does not intrinsically belong as a classification to certain kinds of sounds. The sounds identified as particularly problematic change over time. Noisy sounds have to be actively produced as such through cultural work, campaigning, writing, advertising, so on, what I tend to call the shaping of ways of hearing. In the research I've done, I've come to think of this work as the production of sonic encounter. Sonic encounter is the meeting point of a sound and a hearer. At the moment of hearing, a sound may be encountered as noise or not as noise, or as something else. And my argument is that the encountering of sound as noise is produced socially as part of wider processes of social formation. Directing how we hear is part of how power operates. It's not a singular process, but the shaping of hearing, of how societies hear people and things, is nevertheless part of how societies create order, norms, and discipline. As noises are produced, they become socially active. They produce and sustain social relations. You've seen in the examples I've given that noise has been involved in the production of gendered relations, with women as the object of the critical listening attention of men in the 1930s, or as active listeners to domestic noise in the 1970s. The final few thoughts here about what this means. So I think noise produces and sustains the effective encounter of social relations, gender, class, and race as well, making those categories feel like something. And this is why I'm so interested in the visual depictions of sound, such as this, with the sort of zap lines you get there. What is sound actually doing? In my view, it's activating the social as immediately meaningful. Finally, I want to say just a few brief words about where next for noise in my own work. My own intentions here are to move beyond the European and North American framing of the way in which noise is analysed. The European auditory habitus, which formed noise as a problem, was formed also in the colonial encounter and in the enacting of imperialism. I increasingly think this is essential to explaining modern European ways of hearing, and I think that's where next for the historical research that I want to do. Thank you very much.